This is another of the series of interviews I'm doing with climate experts about how Prime Minister Justin Trudeau can meet his increased emissions targets. He announced them a couple of days ago with Joe Biden's virtual climate summit. So we're going to talk to Michael Bernstein about who's an economist with Canadians for Clean Prosperity, about what policy levers the Prime Minister and the government can pull to get those extra emissions by 2030. So welcome to the interview, Michael.
Good to be with you.
Look, there it is. What kind of policy levers has he got? And are there any that he can apply to specific sectors? Because we know oil and gas, for instance, accounts for 26% of national emissions.
Yeah, well, the most cost-effective policy, as you know, would be to continue to rely on the carbon tax to continue to generate more emissions reductions. But because we already have a very ambitious carbon tax schedule, among the most ambitious in the world, I would not expect that to change. So what remains will be a set of sector-specific policies. And I think you're going to see some policies in each of the following three key sectors: into transport, into buildings, and then into industry, with a focus, as you say, on oil and gas. So if we take those in turn, I think in transport, what you're likely to see, in addition to increased fuel efficiency standards, is you're likely to see a ZEV mandate similar to British Columbia, in addition to some investments in public infrastructure and public transit. In buildings, which is going to be a real challenge here, and we've got 10 million homes that we have to retrofit over the next couple of decades. I hope that what you're going to see is additional funds, even beyond what you saw in the budget, to continue to retrofit, deep retrofits, right? Changing out furnaces, et cetera, of homes all around the country. I think that's largely about spending and incentives. And then in industry, it's going to be specific to that industry, but I'll mention a couple of things that I think are going to be promising. Number one, I think we need to be thinking about strengthening the industrial pricing system, not necessarily the pricing schedule, but how much of each industry's emissions we're actually pricing. Because look, ultimately, those industries are the most knowledgeable and most capable of figuring out how they're going to reduce their own emissions. But where the government has to step in and be more specific, what I'd like to see them focus on is carbon capture and storage, and other kinds of new technologies that we need to get over the cost hump through some public investments. A good example of that would be hydrogen.
Well, let's talk about some of the things you mentioned. So we're talking about the large emitter tax and the federal backstop, as well as the Alberta plan, because I mean, 80 or 90% of oil and gas gets produced in Alberta. But that plan, both of them rely upon what's called output-based allocation systems. And essentially what that does, without getting into all the details, is it gives producers an 80 to 90% discount on the carbon price, and so that they don't feel the same competitive pressures and basically take their investment and leave. And so are you suggesting that they cut back on those discounts?
Yeah, I think that's right. In short, yes, I am. And I think a couple ways that they can do it. In the short term, they can strengthen the actual, what's called the stringency. So as you say, if it's 80% today that they're getting exempt from, that can wind back to 75 and 70, et cetera. But then where we're going to get the most kind of impact is if we move to a system where those emissions are fully priced, so nothing is exempt. But the catch there is we're going to need a border carbon adjustment or some other mechanism, but likely a border carbon adjustment that levels the playing field when some of those products go internationally, because we have to make sure that Canadian producers aren't at a global disadvantage.
Now, I want to ask you about that, because I've interviewed you before about a carbon border adjustment tax, and Trudeau and Biden have already been talking about that. And so the question that kind of hangs around that is, 99% of our oil and gas exports go to the US. So if I'm an oil sands CEO and I'm looking at shipping this incredibly carbon intensive crude oil down to the Midwest and down to the Gulf Coast, and Joe Biden slaps on a carbon border adjustment tax, I'm looking to Justin Trudeau to get me an exemption or some kind of a break. And Justin Trudeau says, I don't think so. I think we're just going to let you take the full brunt of that and let Joe Biden take the political heat for it. I don't know. What do you think about that scenario?
I think that what we're much more likely to see is for the Canadian government to step in and to work hand in hand with the Americans on some sort of coordinated system. Because if we charge that price domestically, we obviously get to keep that money. And we can use that to help those companies out, to invest in clean technology, maybe to provide income tax cuts, or in some other way that benefits us domestically. I think it's very unlikely we allow that money to flow to the US. And the government has pretty much indicated as much in some of its recent documents.
So these reductions, we're talking about a significant reduction by 2030. That gives us 9 years. So some of the things you talked about, like hydrogen or carbon capture and storage, are still, well, they're what Jason Dion from the Institute for Climate Choices said in his recent study. They're wild cards. They probably aren't ready until the 2030s. Can they be scaled up quickly enough to get the job done?
It's going to be challenging. It's true. And look, a carbon capture and storage project takes at minimum 6 years to develop. So even if we were going to get going today, it would still take a while before we see those emissions reductions start to take place. So I think the bottom line message here is we've got to move quickly, and we've got to play a variety of different cards. Because you're right, maybe not all will work out exactly how we thought, but we've got to take measures in all 3 of those sectors, and we've got to move fast. There's not a lot of time.
This will be my final question, Michael, but the federal government has, for the most part, set policy in place, set regulations in place, and then let it play out. So, you know, in the case of Alberta, they negotiated an equivalency agreement on their large emitter tax, and it wasn't maybe what everybody wanted, but the feds recognized it and so on. But this seems like it needs more leadership. It needs the prime minister and the ministers involved to get involved, you know, get everybody together, get organized to act on a quick basis. It can't just put in the policy, negotiate, and kind of let things take their, proceed apace. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, I would. I think this is going to take not only a whole of government approach to get done, but a whole of country approach in some ways. So this is going to be, yes, partially about federal policy and partially about provincial and even municipal policy, but we need the private sector and the investment dollars to crowd into this space to transition our economy in this short time. So that's going to take catalyzing investment firms and banks and a variety of different private sector stakeholders to really all focus on what is a very, very ambitious, albeit achievable, but very ambitious target.
Michael, thanks for this. I really appreciate your insights.
Always good to talk to you, Markham.